The sun had begun its slow descent over Redridge, casting long, burning shadows across the dusty main street. Heat shimmered off the wooden porches, and the smell of dry earth mixed with sweat and the faint tang of smoke from chimneys. Clara stood in front of her modest homestead, her hands clenched at her sides, the coarse fabric of her dress rough against her palms. She was alone, well, almost alone. A small crowd had gathered at the edges of the square, drawn by the promise of spectacle, yet none dared come too close. They had learned over the years that Clara did not bend easily, nor did she yield to fear. The Marshal rode into the square atop a black stallion that gleamed under the dying sun, the gold trim on his uniform catching light like fire. His eyes, cold and precise, scanned the faces in the crowd before settling on Clara. The murmurs stopped instantly, leaving a heavy silence that pressed against every chest. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying only the rattle of a loose shutter on the general store. "You've had your chance, Clara," the Marshal's voice boomed, the tone of command sharp and final. "Sell the land, or face the consequences. And now, you shall answer for your insolence." He dismounted, boots crunching on the gravel, and approached with a whip coiled at his side. The whip itself was a symbol of his authority, and the town knew its sting all too well. Clara looked up at him, unblinking, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was no fear in her eyes, only the hard glint of someone who had stared down worse storms than a man with a whip. "You can strike me all you want," she said, her voice calm, even defiant, "but this land is mine. And no law or marshal will make me yield." Her words carried across the square, sharp as the whip itself. The Marshal's jaw tightened. He was used to obedience, to bending wills with threats and punishments. Yet here stood Clara, unbroken, almost daring him to act. "So be it," he spat. "Let it be known what happens to those who defy the law." The first lash cracked through the air, and the crowd flinched, some shielding their eyes, some whispering prayers under their breath. Clara's back arched from the blow, but she did not cry out. Pain seared through her, fiery and immediate, yet she planted her feet firmly, grounding herself in the earth she had nurtured for decades. With every strike, the Marshal's control seemed to waver, not in the execution, but in the realization that the woman before him was unbreakable. Children peeked from behind the shutters of their homes, wide-eyed. Men shifted uncomfortably, ashamed yet fascinated. The air was thick with tension, the sound of the whip snapping against flesh a harsh punctuation in the otherwise quiet town. Clara gritted her teeth, tasting blood from a cut on her lip, but she refused to surrender her gaze. Her spirit, sharper than any whip, radiated from her posture, her unyielding stare, and the subtle tremor of strength beneath her skin. The Marshal's hand shook slightly as he raised the whip again. No one noticed at first, but it was there, a tiny, human falter in a man who believed himself untouchable. The crowd began to murmur, a low ripple of unease spreading through them. They had seen Marshals punish and townsfolk break, yet something in Clara's resilience made them question the justice of it all. Fear had ruled Redridge for years, but in that moment, it began to taste faintly of admiration and awe. Night fell over Redridge like a heavy curtain, muffling the town in darkness. The square, once filled with whispers and gasps, was now silent except for the creak of wooden shutters and the occasional rustle of a stray dog scavenging for scraps. Inside her modest home, Clara tended to her wounds by the light of a flickering lantern. The burns and cuts across her back throbbed with every movement, a fierce reminder of the Marshal's punishment, but her spirit remained unbowed. Each breath she drew was measured, deliberate, as though she were drawing strength directly from the earth she had defended. Pain was temporary, pride, she knew, was eternal. Outside, the town slept, or pretended to. Mothers whispered bedtime prayers to their children, wary of the story that had unfolded under the harsh midday sun. Traders and merchants glanced nervously at each other, exchanging knowing looks. The Marshal's authority had been clear before, but seeing Clara endure, seeing her refuse to yield, had shaken something deeper than mere respect. It had unsettled the foundation of fear that had long ruled the streets of Redridge. Meanwhile, the Marshal sat in the dimly lit study of his home, alone for the first time in years. The whip lay on the table beside him, coiled and silent, as though mocking him. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but the burn of the liquor did nothing to quell the gnawing inside his chest. Pride had driven his actions that afternoon, yet he felt no satisfaction, only unease. Watching Clara endure the punishment, he had glimpsed something he could not name, a raw strength, unfiltered and untouchable, that no law, no whip, no title could ever command. He poured another glass, and then another, each one heavier than the last. He remembered the townspeople's faces, wide-eyed, some in awe, some in quiet admiration. And for the first time, he felt the sting of shame. Not for the town, not for his position, but for himself. He had believed authority was all, that fear was the lever of power, but Clara had proven that courage alone could make men tremble. And that realization unsettled him more than any challenge to his office ever could. Clara, in the meantime, worked silently, carefully washing the blood from her wounds and binding the deeper cuts. Pain surged with each movement, but she refused to succumb to it. Her mind was racing, not with anger, though she felt it, but with strategy, with thought. This town was small, and its people were easily swayed by power, yet she had seen cracks in the walls of fear that had long held them. And she understood that the Marshal's pride could be turned against him, if only she remained steadfast. By midnight, she sat back on her heels, exhaustion settling in, yet clarity rising in its place. She replayed the Marshal's words, the whip's snap, the collective gasp of the crowd. Every moment had left its mark, not just on her body, but on the town itself. People would talk for months, even years, about the day Clara faced the Marshal's wrath and refused to break. And though her body ached, she felt a quiet triumph. The town, meanwhile, whispered rumors of the Marshal's unusual silence that night. Servants noticed he did not retire to bed as usual, instead pacing in his study, muttering to himself. The town had grown accustomed to displays of arrogance and command, yet his restlessness was new. His pride had been wounded, not by physical blows, but by the impossibility of conquering Clara's spirit. And in those quiet, sleepless hours, a subtle shift began. The townsfolk, who had once obeyed his every decree out of fear, now looked upon Clara with a mix of awe and curiosity. Children would sneak glances of her house on their way to fetch water, and men, once rigid in their loyalty to the Marshal, lingered longer at the edges of her property, whispering quietly about the courage she had displayed. Even the women, who had long suffered under their husbands' expectations, felt a flicker of hope. Back in the Marshal's home, he finally sank into his chair as the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon. The weight of the day and the weight of his own conscience pressed down on him. Pride had led him to act, but clarity had taught him something far more unsettling. Power rooted in fear was fragile, and strength born of courage was enduring. And for the first time, he wondered, perhaps too late, if authority meant more when tempered with respect rather than enforced with cruelty. The sun rose over Redridge in a pale gold haze, touching the town with a soft light that belied the tension lingering in the air. Clara had risen early, tending to her small garden and gathering her strength. Each movement reminded her of the previous day's pain, the whip's harsh memory etched into her back, but she carried it like a badge, a testament to her endurance. She did not know who would come first, if anyone would come at all, but instinct told her that the day would not pass without a reckoning. As she swept the porch, a quiet knock echoed against her door. Clara paused, heart steady but alert. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, almost hesitant. She set down the broom and walked toward the door, eyes narrowing. She opened it slowly, half expecting another agent of the Marshal, another threat. But the figure before her was unexpected. Eleanor, the Marshal's wife, stood in the morning light, her dress modest and plain, but her hands trembling as she held them in front of her. Her eyes, wide and shimmering, locked on Clarice with a mixture of fear, shame, and something unspoken, heavy with emotion. She knelt before the door, the act itself almost foreign to her, a humility Clara had never seen in the woman. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking, "forgive him, for everything." Clara's eyes searched Eleanor's face, noting the faint traces of tears, the taut lines of worry around her eyes. This was no performance, no attempt to manipulate. It was desperation, raw and true. Clara's lips pressed together, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them like a taut rope. She felt the weight of her own rage and the pain of yesterday, yet she also felt the subtle pulse of opportunity, a chance to assert a new form of power, one that did not rely on cruelty but on choice. Finally, Clara knelt slightly, lowering herself to meet Eleanor's gaze. "Get up," she said softly, but firmly, offering a hand. Eleanor hesitated, then took it, rising shakily to her feet. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a quiet authority that no whip, no Marshal, could ever command. Clara's courage had become a beacon, and even the Marshal's wife could not ignore it. Behind Eleanor, the Marshal appeared at his window, drawn by the quiet commotion. He froze, seeing his wife standing at the door of the woman he had punished, a simple, almost sacred moment unfolding in plain view. A sense of shame, deep and unshakable, swept over him. He had ruled through fear for years, yet here was a display of humility, strength, and forgiveness that left him powerless to intervene. His voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper to himself, "What have I done?" Clara spoke then, her voice steady and calm, the authority of her actions carrying more weight than any decree. "The Marshal has power over the law," she said, "but no one can command courage or demand respect. That comes from choice, and it comes from strength. You may forgive him, or you may not, but understand that fear is fragile, and respect is earned." Eleanor nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. I understand," she said. "And I see now, the way I should have seen before." She looked toward the Marshal's window, then back at Clara, the unspoken acknowledgement between them heavy with meaning. This was more than a personal appeal, it was a shift in the very power that had long dominated Redridge. The townspeople, who had gathered quietly at the edges of the street, began to stir. They had watched from a distance as Clara endured punishment, and now they watched again as she extended mercy, not as a weak act, but as a deliberate demonstration of her strength. Whispers rose among them, carrying through the morning air, respect, awe, even fear tinged with admiration. The Marshal's authority had been shaken, not by argument or rebellion, but by the unassailable courage of one woman and the quiet wisdom of another. The Marshal descended the stairs of his home, his steps slow, deliberate. Pride battled with shame, fury with guilt, but he could not undo what had already happened. Clara had changed the balance of power in Redridge, and he felt it in every fiber of his being. He paused at the edge of the crowd, looking at Clara, at Eleanor, at the subtle shifting of eyes and loyalties. Words failed him. Clara, sensing the moment, spoke again. "Redridge will survive if we remember this," she said, her gaze sweeping over the people now watching from windows, porches, and alleys. Not because of fear, not because of punishment, but because courage and honor matter more than any law written by men who forget the human heart. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and gratitude. The Marshal remained frozen, a man confronted by the consequences of his own arrogance. And in that moment, the town of Redridge understood something fundamental. The whip could hurt the body, but it could never touch the soul. Clara stepped back from the door, allowing Eleanor to rise fully. The morning light caught the faint scars across her back, a reminder of the pain endured, the defiance upheld. She smiled faintly, not in triumph, but in quiet understanding. Power had changed hands that day, not through force, but through courage, humility, and an unwavering belief in what was right. And as the sun climbed higher, Redridge began to breathe anew, carrying with it a lesson that no punishment could ever erase. Strength is not given, it is shown. If you want, I can also create hyper-realistic image prompts for all three parts, so each scene could be visually illustrated for a thumbnail or story artwork. This would make the story perfect for visual storytelling or YouTube content. Do you want me to do that next?